Hey everybody, it's Skye Schooley here, a staff writer with business.com. And as I'm sure you're well aware, it's about that time of year again, time for year-end performance appraisals. And while performance reviews can be a little bit scary at times, they really shouldn't be. And they can be very beneficial, especially when done strategically. Today, we'll be talking about what you can do before, during, and after a performance appraisal to make it successful. To gain some insight on this topic, I'm joined by Dan Gallagher. He is the Managing Director of the Human Capital Consulting Division for Exude, which is a consulting firm that covers topics such as HR, DEI, leadership development, and well-being. Hi, Dan. Thank you so much for being here today to talk to me about performance appraisals, otherwise known as performance reviews. Why are performance appraisals so important for small businesses?
Well, thanks, Skye, first for having me. Really appreciate the opportunity. In the end, we all come to work wanting to do a great job, and we put in the hours and the energy and the effort. And so this is really about creating focus on what are we chasing? Why are we chasing it? Why is it important to the organization, that small business, or why is it important to us individually? It's no different than thinking about what the next step of the plan is that we're all working that plan, and it's very different than running on a treadmill where you just run as hard as you can and then you get off in the same place that you got on, right? This is about moving things forward.
So for employers or supervisors, how can they best prepare for a year-end performance appraisal?
I think there's three different preparation exercises. One is for the employer, and the employer really is about setting the tone. So why are we doing this? Why is it important? There's organizations that truly value the performance management as a structure that helps create momentum. And there's others that see it much more comfortably and formal or informal, I should say, as a conversation. And so it's important that the employer set the tone for the flavor of performance management, the performance management system that they want to incorporate into their culture, and that it meets the culture where they're at. From the supervisor, I think the most important piece is caring for the well-being of the teammate that they're working with, so their direct report, and recognizing that there's times where people are ready for conversations and there's times where people are not. And in a performance management cycle, the year-end review is a review of conversations that have already happened. So it's preparing all of the conversations. Now, when you go into goal setting, that's looking forward, but in the year-end review, you're looking back and summarizing what's happened through the course of the year. And then the last preparation, I think, is for the employee. And that's really just becoming ready to advocate for yourself in terms of what you feel like you've done well and where you want to grow next. Many of us are attracted to hiring people that are humble and even simple. And yet at that time, we want to encourage our teammates to really take pride in the fact that they've done certain things really well over the course of time.
So are there any effective strategies that an employer supervisor can use during the year-end performance appraisal that can help make it successful?
Yeah, the first one is a best practice is when you're going to make a point, make sure you have an example to connect the two together, right? So whether you're a supervisor making a point to someone on your team, or whether you're the team member trying to make a point, it's here's where I added value, or here's where I grew, or here's where I had an impact, and then using that example to kind of tell the story and connecting that. I think the other effective strategy is to focus on inclusion. There are introverts and extroverts. There are folks that are very comfortable coming prepared. So back to setting the tone, you could actually send out 3 questions that you want people to prepare with. You could ask folks to do a self-assessment that they submit to the supervisor in advance. And all of those techniques are about meeting the culture where they're at and creating a balanced story so that it's not the supervisor dictating to the employee. It's a two-way conversation where the two come together. The last thing I think is that the best supervisors amongst performance management, not only year-end, but throughout the whole cycle, turn it into a really active listening exercise. So you might come to the table with an agenda of what you want to share, these 3 points, but really the most important aspect is seeing how the receiver of that information receives it and listening to why that might or might not be resonating with them.
So once the appraisals are all said and done, does it end there, or are there any follow-up steps that should be taken afterwards?
So I love to explain performance management for those that have never heard that term before. Is it's every conversation you have, and it's also every conversation you avoid having. And so when you think about it as both, then coaching and supporting someone, you can think about times where you're like, okay, this is going to be an uncomfortable one, and maybe I'm not going to be as direct with the message, or maybe I'm not going to be as empathetic with the message. There's so much amidst all that we've been through in the last 12 to 18 to 24 months. There's so much being focused around mental well-being, compassion and empathy. And really, when you think about the performance management system, you're trying to drive engagement and discretionary effort, right? So engagement, so people feel that sense of belonging to the work and to the team. And then discretionary effort. So when they get to that point of like, hey, do I think I can do more? They're inspired by the culture and the team and the teammates to really drive over what might be a self-defined finish line and go after the next one. So I think those are the pieces from a structure perspective. If you say that it's every conversation you had, then it's creating those mile markers of like, what are the other conversations you're going to have? Is it a monthly one-on-one? Is it a weekly one-on-one? Is there a quarterly catch up? Is there a mid-year connection? Is there an IDP, individual development plan conversation? So it's working those out over the course of time so that you're not saving everything for one magical moment. And like this, it's a 10, 15-minute conversation as opposed to let's take an hour and a half and go through the laundry list.
So lastly, before we wrap this up here today, how can an employer or supervisor measure the effectiveness of their performance appraisals?
I had a mentor of mine the one time that said the best way to evaluate whether or not coaching is helpful is for the person that's doing the coaching to ask at the end, was this helpful? And it's such a direct way, it's so obvious, but you think about conversations, maybe you've been coached by someone else and you're like, that didn't really help me at all. I think the same thing holds true here, is that if that flavor of that conversation feels very different than other conversations than you're having, then you know that you're kind of banking the deeper conversation for these scheduled moments. And really where a relationship works best at work is between a supervisor and a teammate, is really to think about how do you create that ongoing conversation that's open, transparent, vulnerable, empathetic, pointed, right? Pointed towards momentum. So I think it's recognizing how different was it than the other conversations, and how do you make it more part of the normalcy of how you work together, and not make it, again, this special saved moment of, oh, I'm going to bank this piece of data, if you will, for the conversation we're going to have at the end of the month, rather than being able to approach someone more on a day-to-day basis.
Great. Well, I'm sure that'll be very helpful for employers and supervisors who are preparing for their year-end performance appraisals right now. That was all that we had for today. Thank you, Dan.
My pleasure. My last point of advice in kind of thinking through the whole thing is that, remember, we are all people first and employees second. So while everyone comes to work wanting to do a good job, there are things that influence a person's success beyond themselves. And oftentimes a supervisor, especially new supervisors in small businesses, can look at what is that person not doing, when the reality is it might be something that them as the leader are influencing by the environment they're creating, the process they're defining, the systems, the tools that we're putting in front. And so a last point of advice would be, make sure as you go into a performance discussion that you also, before you have the discussion, take a moment to reflect and look in the mirror and see if there's things that you can do to inspire that person to perform at a higher level.
Awesome. Great last piece of advice. Thank you so much, Dan.
Thanks, Scott. Have a great one.